She was 17 years old, barefoot on a black stallion, and she was screaming. Not screaming in fear, not screaming for help, screaming because the wind was in her face and the grass was a blur beneath her, and every person in that valley who had ever told her to sit down, stay quiet, act like a girl, she wanted them to hear her. She wanted every single one of them to know she was coming. Her name was Chaska Winyen. In her language, actually, it meant firstborn woman. But the people who lived in the valley below, the settlers, the soldiers, the Indian agents with their ledgers and their rules, they did not know her name. They did not know anything about her except that she was Lakota, and in their minds that word carried only one meaning. It did not carry her meaning. This isn't a story about a war. It isn't a story about a massacre or a treaty or a political argument between men in rooms far away from the land they were arguing over. Those stories exist, and they matter, and they're true, but this isn't one of them. This is the story of one girl, one black horse, one voice that refused to go quiet even when the world spent 20 years trying to silence it. What happened to Chaska Winyen really happened, and the people in this story were real. The pain was real, which the love was real. The horse, that big, hard-headed, unbreakable black stallion she called Wap Sapa, meaning black leaf, was the most real thing in all of it. Some names have, for what it's worth, been changed to protect the living. Some conversations have been reconstructed from journals, interviews, and oral histories passed down through her family. But the kind of bones of this story, the events, the choices, the moments that changed everything, those are as true as the hill she rode down from. She wasn't a legend when she was alive. She was, to be fair, a girl who got angry. She was actually a woman who refused. She was a kind of mother who chose something no one expected her to choose. And by the time she was done, the valley below those hills would never be exactly the same as it was before she came screaming down out of them on that horse. Pay attention. This is the kind of story they do not teach in schools. Not because it's too violent or too difficult, but because it makes too many people look in the mirror and not like what they see. Her name was Chaska Winyen. Remember it. The morning, Chaska Winyen turned 7 years old, her grandmother pressed a small piece of dried bison meat in her hand and told her something that would take her a full decade to understand. The world will try to name you, her grandmother said. Her name was Thengheng, which meant aunt, though everyone in the camp called her that regardless of whether she actually was their aunt, because she had earned the title so many times over that it had stopped being a word and started being a fact. Thengheng had a face like a canyon wall, deep lines, dark stone, something in it that looked like it had survived a great deal of weather, and wasn't particularly impressed by any of it. She held Chaska's chin in 2 fingers and looked at her the way you look at something you've been responsible for and are proud of but also a little worried about. They will give you a name from their language in their ledgers on their papers. You let them kind of write it down, and you smile if you've to, but you remember your name. You remember it in here. She pressed 1 finger against the center of Chaska's chest, right over the sternum. Not your head. Here. The head forgets when it's afraid. The chest doesn't forget. Chaska ate the dried meat and thought about this for approximately 4 seconds before running off to find her cousin, because she was 7 and her grandmother was always saying things like that. And at 7 years old, you do not fully understand that someday you'll need every single word. She grew up on the edge of the Black Hills, in a camp that moved with the seasons the way it had always moved, the way her people had always moved, not aimlessly but purposefully, following the patterns of the land the way you follow the pattern of a conversation. You go where the conversation leads. You do not force it. The Lakota had been doing this for so long that the land and the people had shaped each other the way a river shapes its banks, and the banks shaped the river, and by the time Chaska was born into it, the relationship between her people and that land was so deep and so old that it was almost invisible from the inside. It was just life. It was just the way things were. She was the eldest of 4 children. Her father, Sungwachasa, horseman, was a quiet, deliberate man who spoke rarely but chose his words the way a craftsman chooses his tools, with precision, with intention, with no wasted motion. He wasn't famous, to be fair, among his people. He wasn't a war chief or a medicine man or a leader whose name traveled on other people's lips. He was a man who knew horses with a depth that went past skill into something closer to language. He understood what a horse was thinking before the horse understood itself. He could read the shift in a horse's weight, the angle of an ear, the tension in a jaw, and translate all of it into decisions that looked like magic from the outside, but were really just the result of a lifetime of paying the kind of attention that most people save for things they love. Chaska inherited pretty much this from him completely, which she was on horseback before she could walk with any confidence. By the time she was 5, she was riding without a rope, sitting straight-backed on a brown like mare 3 times her size, her small hands resting on her thighs, watching everything. By the time she was 9, she had broken her first horse, not beaten it, not forced it, but stood with it for 3 days in a small enclosure, letting it smell her and watch her and decide that she wasn't a threat. And then on the 4th morning, the horse had come to her of its own choice, and that her father told her quietly was the only kind of breaking worth doing. Her to be fair, mother, Wangbley Wing, Eagle Woman, was the opposite of quiet. She was a woman of enormous energy, enormous laugh, enormous opinions about everything from the correct way to tan a hide to the political situation developing to the east that her husband preferred not to discuss. She had strong views on nearly every subject and shared them freely, and she had taught Chaska from birth that silence is a choice, and choosing it was fine, but choosing it out of fear was a waste of a perfectly good voice. Wangbley Wing sang while she worked. She argued with the older women about medicine and won. She once told a soldier who had ridden too far into their camp to leave, in a tone that for what it's worth wasn't angry but was also completely impossible to misunderstand. And he had left. She had watched him go with her, arms crossed, and then gone back to cooking, and Chaska had been 5 years old and had stored that image somewhere in the back of her mind where it would sit for years, useful and waiting. The world outside the camp was changing. Chaska knew this the way children know large things, not through understanding, but through accumulation, through the way the adults spoke differently when they thought the children were not, listening, through the way her father's silences had a new quality to them, a weight, like the silence before thunder rather than the silence of ordinary evening. She knew it through the visitors who came to camp wearing expressions she did not have a word for yet. She knew it through the absence of people who had been there the season before and were not there now. She knew it, most concretely, the summer she was 11 when the soldiers came. They did not come violently. That is important to say, because later, when Chaska told his story, people sometimes assumed the worst right away, assumed that the first moment was also the worst moment. It wasn't. The worst came later, gradually, which is often how the worst things come. Not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough to seem manageable, each one shifting the ground slightly, so that by the time you look back, you can barely see where you were standing when it started. The soldiers came well, with papers and a man who spoke some Lakota, and mostly Lakota-shaped English, and they talked to the men of the camp about land, about boundaries, about agreements. Chaska sat with her mother at the edge of this conversation and watched her father's face. His face told her everything she needed to know, which is to say it told her nothing good. He listened the way he listened to horses, that absolute still attention, the kind that processes everything and shows nothing. When the soldiers left, he sat outside their teepee for a long time, without speaking. Her mother, did not fill the silence, which meant it was serious, because her mother almost always filled silences. "What will happen?" Chaska asked him, finally. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, something that has already begun. She did not understand this then. She actually would, later. What he meant was that by the time you could see a wave coming, the wave has already started. In my opinion, question isn't whether it comes. The question is how you stand when it arrives. The wave arrived in stages. First there were more soldiers, which then there were survey teams, men with instruments who walked across the land measuring things that the Lakota did not believe could be measured. Not because they were mystical about it, but because the idea of owning a piece of prairie the way you own a pot or a knife seemed to them simply a confused way of thinking about a thing. You belong to the land. The land doesn't belong to you. This isn't poetry. It is ecology. It pretty much is the same understanding that kept their relationship with the bison sustainable for centuries while other relationships with the land were not sustainable and collapsed. But the men with instruments did not think in those terms, and the papers they carried did not speak that language, and so the survey continued. Pretty much then came the agency. A building, which became several buildings, which became a compound, which became a place where Lakota people were expected to go, to register, to receive, to be counted. Chaska's family went because not going was more dangerous than going, and because her father was a man who preferred to understand a thing before deciding how to respond to it, and you couldn't understand the agency without going there. Chaska went with her father the first time, and she watched everything. She watched the way the agent, a thin man with a red face and a constant expression of mild irritation, as if the entire world were failing to meet some standard he had set for it, wrote names in a ledger. She, I think, watched the way he struggled with Lakota names, and then, after a short struggle, simply did not bother. He wrote approximations. Plus, he wrote translations. He wrote, in one case, a name that bore essentially no relationship to the actual name of the person he was registering, and the person stood there and let him write it, because arguing about a name written in a ledger wasn't the battle to spend energy on when there were larger things at stake. Chaska watched the agent write her name, which he wrote something that sounded like Chaska, but was spelled differently and came out wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate, except that it felt like someone had drawn a picture of her face from memory without having looked at her directly. It resembled her. It wasn't her. She pressed her hand against the center of her chest, the way her grandmother had shown her, and remembered her name the correct way. That year, the year she was 11, was also the year she found Wapsapa. He wasn't a foal. He was 3, basically, years old, which in horse terms means he was at the precise age of maximum difficulty. Old enough to know his own mind, young enough to still be making poor decisions about how to express it. He was black in a way that certain things are black. Not a color exactly, but an absence of other colors, a darkness that seemed to come from inside the animal rather than from his coat. He was big, even for 3. He had a scar on his left shoulder from something that had happened before Chaska's family came to know of him. A pale ridge of healed tissue that her father's friend Chinthectheopiope had pointed to when explaining why this horse was available. He had thrown like 3 riders, which not because he was afraid, because he had decided, based on available evidence, that he did not want a rider on his back. He was making this decision in the most direct way available to him. Chaska looked at him for a long time. He threw Chinthectheopiope's cousin twice, her father said, standing behind her. The second time the cousin was in the air long enough to think about it. Chaska said, he is angry about something. Probably, her father agreed. I want basically him. Her father was quiet for a moment. You understand what you're asking? Yes. He thought about it. He looked at the horse, then at his daughter, then at the horse again, and something in the comparison seemed to resolve a question he had been working on. All right, he said, but you go slow, and if he hurts you, we talk again. She went slow. She spent the first day simply being near him, not approaching, just present, sitting on the ground 20 feet away and whittling a stick into nothing with a small knife, letting him get used to the fact of her. He watched her with his ears forward, which she noted. Ears forward meant attention, not fear. He was curious. That was workable, which the second day, she moved closer. Not for what it's worth, all the way, just a little. She talked to him, not in words that meant anything specific, but in the rhythm and tone of Lakota's speech, the cadence of it, the music of it. Because horses do not hear words, but they hear meaning, and the meaning she was putting into her voice was, I see you. I'm not a threat. I'm interested in my opinion. You basically, not in what you can do for me, but in what you're. On the 4th day, he came to her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could see the detail of his face, the dark, intelligent eye, the way his nostrils worked over her smell, and filed it under some category she hoped was favorable. TBH, she did not move. She barely breathed. He stood for what it's worth, there for a full minute, which is a long time in horse minutes, and then he walked away, which she did not take as rejection, but as conclusion. He had gathered the information he needed, and he was done for the day. On the 7th day, she put her hand on his neck. He flinched, just slightly, a ripple of muscle, but he sort of did not move away. Her father watched from a distance and said nothing. By the end of 2 weeks, she was on his back, and the feeling was unlike anything she had words for. Not triumph, not exactly, but something more mutual than that. Not her winning and him losing, both of them deciding something together. She sat on him, and he stood still beneath her, and the stillness felt like agreement, and agreement felt better than victory by a significant margin. She, I think, called him Wapsapa, Black Leaf. Plus, she wasn't entirely sure why that name, except that it came to her when she was on his back for the first time, and looked down at his neck, and the name was simply there, as if it had been waiting. He was hers, in the way that things that choose you're more yours than things you choose. The next 3 years were not simple. Nothing about that period was simple for anyone in the camp, or in any Lakota camp, anywhere along the edge of the territory that was slowly, consistently, legally, which is to say through the mechanism of papers signed by men with more guns than the people being asked to sign, being taken. Chaska was old enough now to understand more of what the adults were discussing. She was old enough to see the fuller shape of what was happening. The bison herds were smaller. People who had gone to the agency hadn't come back the same. There were arguments in camp about what to do, about which path had less disaster in it, about whether cooperation was wisdom or surrender, and whether those two things could be told apart from the outside. Her grandmother Thenghang grew older and quieter, which in a woman who had always been somewhat quiet already meant she was becoming very quiet indeed. She sat more and moved less, and when she spoke it was in a concentrated way, as if she was aware that her words were a finite resource, and she was being careful about the remaining ones. She told Chaska stories. Long ones, old ones, the kind of stories that carry information about who your people aren't in a list of facts, but in the shape of things, the way a stone's shape tells you what kind of water moved over it. Chaska listened, I guess, to all of them. She stored them the way her father stored his knowledge of horses, not memorized, but internalized, part of the body, available without having to think about them. When Chaska was 14, the agent at the agency told her father that she needed to go to school. Not a request, a requirement, enforced by something called an act, which her father read. He had learned to read English carefully because he believed you should be able to read the papers people were handing you, and confirmed was exactly what the agent said it was. Children basically of school age would attend the government school at the agency. This was the law, which the law did not ask her father's opinion. Her father, for what it's worth, came home and told Chaska, and she watched his face, and his face told her everything again. He wasn't panicking. He was also not at peace. He was in the place between, the place where a man who has been raised to think carefully about things is confronted with something that doesn't yield to careful thinking. Will you go? He asked her. This was the question he asked. Not you'll go, or you must go. Will you go? Because even in a situation that was being imposed on them from the outside, he was asking her to make a choice rather than simply receive one. She understood this later as one of the most important things he ever did for her. Yes, she said. I want to sort of see what they're teaching. She went to the school, and the school was its own country. A building with walls and windows and a clock on the wall that divided the day into pieces, each piece assigned a purpose. She sat in rows with other children, some from her camp, some from camps she had never visited. She was given sort of a different name there, a name from the ledger, the wrong-shaped name. The teacher, a woman from far east with kind eyes and very firm opinions about the correct way to pronounce the English alphabet, called her this name when she called roll in the morning, and Chaska answered to it and pressed her hand against the center of her chest and remembered her real name. In my opinion, she learned English, not because she was told to, and not because she wanted to replace her own language, but because her mother had told her that a voice that can speak only one language is a voice that can be shut out of half the conversations that determine your life. She, was quick with it, uncomfortably quick from the teacher's perspective, because a student who learns fast enough to start asking hard questions is a more complicated kind of student than anyone in an agency school was really prepared to handle. She asked one afternoon why the history in the textbook did not match the history her grandmother had told her. She asked this genuinely, without aggression, the way you ask when you want to understand a discrepancy. The teacher looked at her for a moment and said that some histories were more accurate than others. Chaska said, with the absolute devastating politeness of a 14-year-old who has already thought this through, how do we know which ones? The teacher did not have a satisfying answer to this. Very few people did, and she rode Wapsapa to school every morning and back every evening because the agency hadn't told her she couldn't, and She was of the opinion that she should do a thing until she was explicitly told not to, rather than not doing it out of preemptive caution. The horse stood outside the school building all day, tied to a post that had been meant for a different purpose, watching the door with the focused patience of an animal that has decided its person is inside, and therefore the important thing is to be present when the person comes back out. Other children laughed at her for this at first. She let them. Then one girl, Lakota girl from another camp named Chiwitha, who was 13 and had a personality that was at least 90% sharp corner, said, "Is that your horse?" With the tone of someone who suspects the answer is yes, and is revising their opinion of the person in front of them upward. "Yes," Chaska said. "Did you break him yourself?" "He helped," Chaska said. Chiwitha thought about this. "I want to learn," she said. It wasn't, quite a question. Chaska looked at her for a moment, cataloging her the same way she cataloged horses. The quality of, the attention, the steadiness of the eyes, whether there was fear underneath the sharp corners or something more useful. There, in my opinion, was something more useful. "Come after school," she said. That was the beginning of a friendship that would last, with interruptions, distances, and silences that were the forced kind rather than the chosen kind, for the rest of both their lives. Look, but that comes later. What matters now is that in the afternoon after school, Chiwitha came, and Chaska taught her the first thing. Stand still. Be present. Let the horse decide to come to you. Do not rush it. Chiwitha, whose natural speed setting was the opposite of still, struggled with this. She shifted her weight. She made a small sound. The horse, Wap Sapa, who was now 4 and had the confidence of a horse who has, decided he knows who he is, watched her from across the small enclosure, and did not come. "You're thinking too loud," Chaska told her. "That's not a thing." "It is a thing." Chiwitha looked skeptical, but she stilled herself. Plus she stopped shifting. She let her breathing slow down, and she stood there with the uncomfortable posture of someone who isn't naturally a still person trying to be still because they've decided to try. And after 3 minutes, which felt to Chiwitha like 30, Wap Sapa moved one step toward her. Just one. Then stopped. Chiwitha made a sound like all the air going out of her at once. Chaska said nothing. But she felt the thing she always felt when someone else had their first real exchange with a horse. That small, private satisfaction of watching a door open that somebody had thought was a wall. That evening she rode home with Wap Sapa, moving easily beneath her, the hills rising ahead of her, the sky going the particular orange-purple of a late summer evening over the plains, and she thought about the day, and about the school, and about the name in the ledger, and about her grandmother's finger pressed against her sternum. For what it's worth, she was 14. She did not yet know exactly what was coming. But she pressed, I think, her hand against the center of her chest, feeling the beat of her own heart steady and regular under her palm. And she thought, I know who I'm. The hills held her, and the horse carried her, and the evening light made everything briefly golden. And for one moment, before all the harder things came, the world was simply this, a girl on a black horse, going home. The wave was still building. It had been building for years. But tonight, it hadn't arrived yet, and she rode through the temporary grace of that fact with her spine straight, her eyes forward, and the name her grandmother had given her burning bright and untranslatable in the center of her chest. The winter she turned 15 was the hardest winter in the memory of anyone still alive to have a memory of winters, which in camp terms meant it. Was the hardest in about 60 years, because Theng Heng remembered one just like it when she was a small child and said so, and Theng Heng did not exaggerate. The cold came down off the hills like something with a purpose. It found the gaps in everything, the gaps in the teepee skins, the gaps between heartbeats, the gaps between what people had stored and what they actually needed. The bison that should have been there were not there in the numbers they should have been, for reasons that sort of had been clear to everyone paying attention for the past several years. The agency had supplies. For what it's worth, agency distributed these supplies on a schedule that did not account for the cold, which is, to say the schedule was set somewhere far away by people who did not have to live inside it. Chaska's family wasn't starving. They were careful people who had prepared as well as the available circumstances allowed, and her father was a man who had been watching the horizon of their situation for long enough that he had made adjustments. But careful and Prepared are relative terms when the external conditions continue to change faster than preparation can account for them. They were warm enough and fed enough, and that was something, but the gap between enough and comfortable was wide that winter, and everyone in the camp understood exactly how wide. What the winter taught Chaska, not as a lesson delivered by a teacher, but as a fact delivered by the experience of living through it, was that scarcity doesn't simplify people. People who have TBH, plenty, can afford to be simple. They can afford to be generous or selfish or lazy or industrious because the consequences of their choices aren't immediate. Scarcity makes everything immediate. Every choice is weight. Every choice is about something real. She watched this happen in camp, and it wasn't always the worst version of people that came out. Sometimes it was, but sometimes, often enough to hold on to, it was something else. The old women who shared their wood without being asked. The young men who went out in the worst weather because someone else needed something. Her mother, who redistributed food with the quiet efficiency of someone who had thought about fairness long before it became a practical necessity, and did it without dramatics because in her view doing the right thing did not require an audience. Chiwitha came to spend part of that winter with Chaska's family. Her own camp honestly had moved, and the move had separated her from people she had been living with, and the agency school had become a kind of gravitational center for children from different camps. Not by design, not as a good thing exactly, but as a result. Chiwitha showed up kind of at the teepee one evening with her bedding under her arm, and the particular expression of a person who's going to ask for something and has already decided they aren't going to be embarrassed about asking for it. Wangbley Wing took one, looked at her, and said, "Good, you can help with the cooking," and that was the full extent of the welcome, which was exactly the right amount. Two girls shared a sleeping space that winter, which meant they talked in the dark in the way that girls talk when the dark makes honesty easier. They talked about the school, and about the names in the ledger, and about what was happening to the land and what it meant. They talked about horses. They talked about the older boys in camp, with the particular analytical detachment of two girls who are too busy with more interesting things to be very romantic about it, but aren't entirely unaware. They talked about their grandmothers and what their grandmothers had told them. It turned out that Chiwitha's grandmother had told her different, but related things, versions of the same understanding dressed in different language, the way the same river looks different from different places on its bank. "My grandmother says the world changes whether you want it to or not," Chiwitha said one night, her voice coming out of the dark flat and thoughtful. "She says the question is whether you're still yourself when it's done changing." Chaska thought about this. "My grandmother says remember your name." "Same thing," Chiwitha said. Chaska thought about it more. "Yes," she agreed, "same thing." In the spring, the school year ended, and an argument began. It began quietly, the way serious arguments always begin, not as an argument at first, but as a difference of opinion about a practical matter, which is just an argument that hasn't gotten warm yet. The agent at the agency had a new idea. He had been corresponding with people further east about an initiative that was being described in positive terms. Some Lakota children who were promising students, would be sent to a school. Not the agency school, a real school. A school in the east, where they would receive a thorough education and return better equipped to navigate the new world. The agent presented this to Chaska's father as an opportunity. Chaska's, father read everything the agent gave him, which took time, and asked questions in English, which the agent answered with the slightly pained patience of a man who had expected less thoroughness. Her father brought the materials home and spread them on the ground and read them again. Her mother sat beside him and listened to him read aloud, and her face went through several distinct expressions that she did not bother to conceal. The school was far away. Pennsylvania, a word that sounded to Chaska's ear like a word in another language that had been smoothed flat, and the meaning had come off in the smoothing. The school was called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Its motto, which the agent had written down with evident approval, was "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Chaska's mother heard this and made a sound. It was a small sound, a single brief exhalation through the nose. It was the sound she made when she had already finished having an opinion about something and was now in the phase of deciding what to do about having that opinion. Chaska recognized the sound, which it meant that whatever her mother said next would be a decision, not a feeling. Her mother said no. Her father set the papers down. He looked at them for a moment in the way he looked at things he hadn't yet decided about. They will enforce it, he said. This wasn't agreement. TBH, it was information. It was the kind of thing her father said when he wanted to make sure all the facts were on the table before anyone made a decision based on fewer than all the facts. They will try, her mother said. Plus, this exchange, brief as it was, contained everything. The agent did not have the authority to compel them. Not immediately, not directly, but authority has many forms, and the form it takes when you're a Lakota family in the 1870s living inside a structure of laws and agreements and ledgers and guns that was designed by other people and aimed at you has a particular weight that doesn't require explicit force to be felt. You know it's there. It changes the calculation of every choice. Chaska had been sitting outside the teepee listening through the skin. She was 15, and she was old enough to be included in this conversation and young enough that she hadn't yet insisted on it. She heard everything. She sat with her back against the outer wall, and Wapsapa tied nearby, and she listened to her parents decide whether she would be sent away, and she felt something in her chest that wasn't quite fear and not quite anger, but was a version of the feeling you get when you realize that a decision about your life is being made, and you aren't in the room where it's being made. She went inside, and her parents looked at her. Her father, who knew she had been listening. He always knew, because he was a man who missed very little, simply waited. I'm not going, Chaska said. Her mother looked at her with an expression that was complicated. Not disagreement. Something, I guess, more layered than that. It isn't that simple, she said, and in her mother's voice saying that, Chaska heard the same thing she had heard in her father's voice when he said they would enforce it. Not agreement, just information. The shape of the real situation, which had edges. I know it has sense simple, Chaska said. I'm still not of my opinion. Going. She hadn't planned to say this. She hadn't come inside with a speech prepared. The words had come out of somewhere that wasn't her thinking mind. They had come out of the center of her chest, the place her grandmother had pointed to. They arrived in a room fully formed and final in a way that surprised her a little, but did not feel wrong. Her father looked at her for a long time. Then, he said, then, we need to think carefully. Thinking carefully, in her father's vocabulary, meant thinking about all possible consequences and preparing for as many of them as possible, rather than simply choosing the most satisfying response and hoping the consequences would sort themselves out. It meant taking seriously the fact that defiance has costs and that some of those costs fall on people other than the person doing the defying. It meant looking at the whole situation rather than just the part that made you angry. Chaska thought carefully. She spent 3 days thinking carefully. She rode Wapsapa every morning of those 3 days, long rides out into the hills, not racing anywhere, just moving at a steady walk with the hills rising around her and the sky enormous above and the horses breathing steady beneath her. And she thought. She thought about Carlisle and what it meant. She thought about the motto, kill the Indian in him. She turned this for what it's worth. Phrase over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. Underneath it, she found something that frightened her more than anything physical she had ever been frightened by. Not pain, which not distance. Not hard weather or scarcity or difficulty. The thing underneath the motto was, what if you go and you come back and you aren't the same person who left? Not changed in the way that all people change when they encounter the world, which is a natural and good change. Changed in the way of a thing that has been broken and then set wrong, so that when it heals crooked, and the crookedness is invisible from the outside, but you feel it every time you move. What if you go and you come back and you can't find your name anymore? That pretty much was the thing. She came back from the third morning's ride and told her parents what she had decided. She wouldn't go to Carlisle. She would continue at the agency school, where she could ride Wapsapa to the door every morning and home every evening, where she could sleep in her grandmother's camp and hear Lakota spoken around the fire and remember who she was. If there were consequences for this, she would face them. She had thought about the consequences, and she was prepared to face them. Her father looked at her with the evaluating look of a man who's deciding whether a horse is ready. He looked for a long time. Then he nodded once, the nod that meant, I have assessed this, and I'm satisfied. Then, we prepare, he said. The summer that followed was a summer of preparation, which looked from the outside like an ordinary summer. Horses, camp life, the agency school, chill with the teaching. Herself to ride with the focused ferocity of someone who has decided to be good at something and doesn't intend to be bad at it for long. But underneath the TBH, ordinary surface things were shifting. Her father was having conversations she wasn't part of, but whose existence she could feel the way you can feel a current in a river, even when the surface looks still. Her mother was more watchful than usual, her eyes spending more time on the road from the agency. Feng Heng, who was having a hard summer physically, moving more slowly, tiring more easily, her hands showing a stiffness that hadn't been there the winter before, talked to Chaska with more intensity than usual, more concentration, as if she had a quantity of things to transfer, and was aware of the constraint of time. It was Feng Heng who told her about the woman who rode. Not a basically story from the distant past, a story from 60 years ago, which in an oral tradition is recent enough to have witnesses still alive or witnesses of witnesses. A woman in the camp of Feng Heng's grandmother's grandmother who had been known, she said, for riding in a way that people remembered long after other things had been forgotten. Not because of what she rode, but because of how, without hesitation, without looking back, as if the direction she was going was the only direction there was. This woman had been, Feng Heng said, someone who understood that there's a kind of message you can only send with your body, moving through space. Words can be refused. A person in motion, certain of direction, is harder to refuse. The hills can be a pulpit. A horse can be a voice. Chaska listened to this story on a summer afternoon, with the smoke from the fire going straight up in the still air, and her grandmother's voice carrying the words the way water carries things, not pushing them but bearing them, letting the current do the work. She thought about it later, on Wapsapa's back, the hills around her. The I think agent came to the camp in August. He came with a colleague and a document and the specific manner of a man who had decided that his patience had expired, and he was going to handle a situation. He spoke with her father. The conversation was polite in its surface, which is the kind of politeness that's really just formality stripped of warmth, and it made the same point the motto made. This is happening. The question is how. Chaska stood at a distance and watched. Wapsapa stood beside her, untied, because she had stopped tying him a year ago. He didn't go anywhere without her anymore, and she had decided that keeping a rope on something that chose to stay was an insult to the choice. She TBH, watched the agent, and she thought about the woman who rode. She thought about a kind of message that words can't deliver. She thought about her name burning in her chest. She thought about everything her grandmother had ever told her, and her mother's voice, and her father's careful thinking, and chew with his sharp corners, and the 3 days of riding in the hills with a question that had answered itself. She did not decide anything specific that day, but she felt something settle in her. Something kind of that had been a question finished becoming an answer. The agent, I guess, came back 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that. Each time the conversation had the same shape and the same conclusion. The girl would be sent to school. Like it was the law. It was being enforced throughout the territory. There were no exceptions being made. Her father listened each time and said he would consider it and asked clarifying questions about specific aspects of the law and bought time with the careful precision of a man who understood that buying time is its own kind of action. Chaska used the time. She talked to every woman in camp who would talk to her about what had happened to families who had sent children to the Eastern schools. Some of the stories were not bad. A few children had come back with skills that were genuinely useful, with knowledge of the Eastern world that they had navigated with enough self-possession to keep themselves intact. But some of, I think, the stories were the other kind. Children who came back and were neither here nor there, not at home in the world they had left, and not at home in the world they had entered, and not entirely sure anymore which language the important parts of their thoughts were in. Children who came back and flinched from their own language, and that flinching wasn't their fault, it was what had been done to them, but the damage was real regardless of its origin. She thought about those children, and she thought about her own name and the place her grandmother had showed her where the name was kept, and she thought, I won't go. Not because she was afraid of learning. She wasn't afraid of learning. She had learned English. She had learned to read the papers that were being used to reshape her world. She would learn anything that gave her better tools for being in this world. but she would learn it as Chaska Winyen. She would learn it with her name intact. She wouldn't pay for knowledge with herself. The price was wrong. Plus, the price was the one thing she couldn't replace. The evening before the agent was due to come again with a final determination, she sat outside with her grandmother. The sun was going down over the hills, and Theng Heng was wrapped in a blanket and looking at the hills with the expression of a person who has looked at something for a long time and still finds it worth looking at. Tomorrow, Chaska said. Yes, Theng Heng said. I know what I'm going to do. Her grandmother looked at her. Her eyes were still sharp, still precise, even as the rest of her was slowing down. Tell me, she said. Chaska told her, and not in detail. The plan wasn't fully formed in detail, but its shape was clear. Theng Heng listened with her eyes on the hills, and her hands still in her lap, and her breath even and unhurried. When Chaska was done, Theng Heng was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, you know there will be consequences. Yes. You know it will be hard. Yes. And here her grandmother paused, and the pause had a weight to it, a particular tenderness, the kind that comes from loving someone and knowing you can't protect them from everything, that it won't fix everything, that doing this won't solve all of it. I know, Chaska said. I'm not trying to solve all of it. I'm trying to be myself while it happens. Theng Heng was quiet. The sort of hills were dark now, the sky still holding light at its edge, but the land below going to shadow. A bird somewhere made a sound and was answered by another bird, and then both fell quiet. Theng Heng pressed her hand against the center of Chaska's chest, the same gesture she had made when Chaska was 7 years old. The same 2 fingers, the same precise location. Good, she said. Then, you know your name. The morning came bright and cold and clear, the way mornings come when the weather isn't going to cooperate with your preferences or your fears, but is simply going to be what it's. Chaska rose before dawn. She saddled Wap Sapa in the dark, working by feel and long familiarity, and she looked at the hills above the camp, black against the sky that wasn't yet light. She thought about the woman who rode, which she pressed her hand against her chest. Then, she put her foot in the stirrup, and she swung up on a Wap Sapa's back, and he moved under her with that particular readiness he always had, that quality of an engine that has been running for a long time, and knows exactly what it's capable of, and she turned him toward the hills. She was going to ride them. Not away, not running, not hiding, but she was going to ride the hills and come back down from them in full daylight, in full sight of anyone who happened to be watching, on a black horse that she had earned and named and trusted with her life, with her spine straight, and her voice ready, and her name burning in the center of her chest like something that can't be put in a ledger. She did not know yet what words she would say when she came down. She did not know the exact shape of what was about to happen. But she knew, with the certainty of a person who has thought carefully and felt deeply and arrived at something true, that she was about to say something, and that whatever she said, she was going to say it as herself. Wap Sapa felt her certainty. He always did. He lifted his head, and his ears came forward, and he moved toward the hills at a walk that was already gathering itself toward something faster. The sky was beginning to turn, and the hills were waiting. She went up into them. Plus, she came down from the hills at a full gallop, and she was shouting. Not words, not yet, which just sound. The sound, of a person who has been climbing a hill in the dark and has reached the top and turned around and seen the full width of everything. And the seeing has made them need to be loud in a way that has nothing to do with strategy. The sound came out of her like a physical thing, like something the chest had been holding and couldn't hold anymore, and Wap Sapa heard it and answered in the way horses answer a rider's energy. He opened up fully, his stride lengthening to the long ground-covering gallop he was capable of when he wasn't holding back, his hooves hitting the slope in a rhythm that traveled up through her body and into her spine and out the top of her head, and the morning light was coming over the eastern hills in long orange bars, and she was in it, moving through it, her hair loose and her voice out, and the camp below her waking up to the sound. People came out of their teepees, and the agent and his colleague were there. They had arrived early, which she hadn't expected, but did not change anything. They were standing with her father near the edge of the camp, and they turned when they heard her coming, and she saw their faces from 50 yards, and then 30. Then she pulled Wop Sapa to a stop in a way that sent up a spray of morning earth, and the horse danced sideways twice before she settled him, and everything was very still for a moment. The agent said something to her father in a low voice. Her father said nothing. Plus, actually, Chaska looked at the agent from Wop Sapa's back. She was taller than him from up there, which she was aware of, and did not think about for more than a second because the height wasn't the point. The point was her voice. Look, Chaska Winyin, she said. In English. Clearly, that is my name. Not the kind of name in your book, my name. The agent looked at her. He was a man who had developed over years of this work a particular expression for situations he had decided to classify as difficult but manageable. A slight tightening around the eyes, a firmness of the mouth, the look of a person who has a protocol for this. Miss, he began. Chaska Winyin, she said again, the same way you say something the second time when you've said it once and been talked past. Not louder, not angrier, just more complete. As if the first time was the introduction and this time is the definition. The agent's colleague, a younger man who had the look of someone who hadn't been doing this work long enough to have a protocol for it yet, was watching her with an expression she would think about later. Not hostility, not contempt, something more complicated than that. Something that looked like a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. Her father stepped forward then, not toward Chaska, but toward the agent, placing himself in the conversation in a way that wasn't confrontational, but was very deliberate, and he said, in his careful English, my daughter will remain here. I like, basically, to discuss the legal specifics of this requirement, specifically the provisions for family circumstances and health considerations. I have some questions. He always had questions. He had questions the way a lawyer has questions, because the questions were the method, because making someone answer precisely is its own kind of argument. The agent did not look pleased, but he was a man who operated through procedure, and her father's insistence on engaging with the procedure rather than fighting it meant that the conversation had to proceed in the way procedure demanded. He pulled out papers. Her father examined them. Questions, I guess, were asked and answered, some correctly, some less correctly, and Chaska sat on Wop Sapa's back and listened to all of it and watched the agent's colleague, who watched her back with that complicated expression, and she kept her spine straight and her hands easy on the reins. The conversation went on for over an hour. It did not resolve into anything final that morning. Her father had enough questions and enough specific knowledge of the documents to ensure that nothing could be finalized without further correspondence. And further correspondence meant time, and time was the thing he had been buying all along. When the agent and his colleague left, her father watched them go without expression. Then he turned and looked at Chaska, still on the horse. Good, he said, and one word. That was everything. She got down from Wop Sapa and walked the horse back to water and stood with him while he drank and let the morning settle around her. Her mother appeared honestly at her elbow, which was a thing her mother did when she had something to say but was deciding how to say it. She stood there for a moment, watching the horse drink. The colleague, her mother said. He wasn't with the agency before. Chaska had enticed this to. No, he is someone new. Her mother paused. New people see things fresh. Sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it transcend. Her mother walked away to start the morning's work, leaving Chaska with this observation to carry around, which was exactly what her mother intended. She had a gift for handing people thinking and then disappearing before you could ask her to do more of it for you. She would have found her that afternoon. She, TBH, had heard about the morning from 3 different people, each of whom had given her a slightly different version, which was the nature of eyewitness testimony when people see a thing that surprises them. She stood in front of Chaska with her arms crossed, and that expression she had, the one that looked like suspicion but was actually evaluation, and said, "You came down from the hills shouting." Yes. What were you shouting? At first, just sound. Then I said my name. Chuida uncrossed her arms. She sat down on the ground with the decisive movement of someone who has decided this is going to be a longer conversation than standing is appropriate for. Tell me all of it, she said. Chaska told her all of it, including the hour of her father's questions, which Chuida found particularly satisfying. Questions as a weapon, Chuida said. I never thought about that. He has always done it, Chaska said. I grew up pretty much watching him do it, and I did not understand what he was doing until this year. He is always doing it. The questions make the other person have to slow down, Chiwitha said, working this out as she spoke. They have to stop and answer, and while they're answering, they aren't doing the other thing. Yes, and sometimes answering honestly makes them confront something they were not planning to confront. Chiwitha thought about this with the focused intensity she brought to anything she found genuinely interesting. Your father is very smart. He is. Your mother is scarier. Chaska laughed. It came out sudden and real, the kind of laugh that doesn't give you a chance to decide whether you're going to laugh before it's already happening. Yes, she agreed, which yes, she's. The conversation with the agent continued over the next several weeks in letters and formal visits, and during this time the camp went about its life with the particular quality of people who are living under uncertainty, but aren't going to let the uncertainty be the loudest thing in the room. Work continued. Children went to the agency school and came back and did their other work. The older people talked and told stories, and the fires burned in the evenings, and the quality of the light through the teepee skins was the same warm amber it had always been. Feng Heng got worse. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but gradually the way the light changes in a room when the sun is going down, and you don't notice it until you try to do something that requires more light than you've. For what it's worth, she was less mobile. Her voice, which had always been clear and deliberate, had a tiredness in it that was new. She spent more time wrapped in her blanket and less time contributing to the loud, ongoing argument that was a normal feature of any given day in the life of a camp of Lakota women. Chaska spent more time with her, not because anyone asked her to, because she wanted to, and because something in the quality of these evenings had a particular weight that she wasn't going to waste by being somewhere else. Feng Heng talked about the old times, not with nostalgia, not with the sweet ache of someone mourning what was gone, but with the directness of someone delivering information. She talked about the women she had known whose names deserved to be remembered. She talked about the knowledge that had been gathered in their people across generations, and the ways it was stored, not in books, but in practice, in story, in a specific way you do a thing, and the reason you do it that way. She talked, to be fair, about how to listen to land, to animals, to weather. She talked about medicine plants and their properties and the ways they worked, specific and practical, the kind of knowledge that can't be found in any book because no one from the outside thought to write it down or thought it was worth writing. Chaska was writing it down. She basically had started keeping a small journal. She had been taught to write at the agency school, and she had taken the skill and bent it toward purposes the school hadn't anticipated. She pretty much wrote in English because that was the writing she had been taught, but she wrote Lakota words when the English ones were not sufficient, which was often. She wrote what her grandmother told her. She wrote the names of plants and their uses. She wrote the stories, as much of the shape of them as she could get on paper, knowing that paper could only hold a fraction of what a voice could carry, but a fraction was better than nothing. Her pretty much grandmother saw her writing one evening and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "You are making a record." "Yes." "Who for?" Chaska thought about this. "I don't know yet, and maybe for me, maybe for later." Feng Heng considered this. "Later is a good reason," she said. The colleague came back alone one morning in late September. Not with papers, not with a formal manner. He arrived on foot, which was unusual, having left his horse at the agency, and he asked to speak with the family. He introduced himself as William Hartley. He was young, Chaska thought, not young in age. He was probably in his late 20s, but young in the sense of someone who hadn't yet had enough of his ideas confronted with enough of the world. He had an earnest quality that she found slightly exhausting and also genuine enough to be worth taking seriously. He actually told her father that he had been reviewing the legal provisions more carefully. He mentioned certain provisions regarding proved attendance at the local agency school and educational progress already made. He said, in the particular careful way of a man who's doing something that's slightly outside his prescribed role but has decided to do it anyway, that there were arguments to be made on the basis of existing precedent for an exception in Chaska's case. He seemed to feel strongly about this. He seemed to feel strongly about it in the way that people feel strongly about things when they've confronted themselves about something recently. Her father listened with the absolute attention. Then he asked 6 questions, precise and sequential, each one building on the answer to the last, until the legal structure of what Hartley was proposing was as fully detailed as it could be. Hartley answered each question honestly. Chaska noticed that he did not hedge or qualify in the way that people hedge when they're trying to avoid commitment. He answered as plainly as he knew how, and when he did not know something, he said so, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience of agency men. When the conversation was over and Hartley had gone back to his horse and ridden away, Chaska looked at her mother, and her mother was wearing the evaluating expression, the one that meant she was revising a position. He saw something, her mother said. When I came down from the hills, Chaska said. She had understood this the morning it happened, had seen it in his face. What did he see? Chaska thought about how to say it. He saw that I was a person, she said finally, knowing this sounded smaller than she meant it. A specific person, not a category. Her mother was quiet for a moment. That is more than some people ever see, she said. Over the weeks that followed, the formal process of documentation and exception filing moved through its channels at the pace of bureaucratic correspondence, which is to say slowly and with frustrations, but it moved. Her father wrote letters in careful English. Hartley filed documents, which the agent, who had opinions about all of this, had to content himself with expressing those opinions within the structure of a process that wasn't designed for his opinions to stop it. Chaska continued going to school. She continued riding Wap Sapa to the door every morning, which the teacher had long since stopped remarking on. She continued writing in her journal. She continued spending evenings with Theng Heng, gathering what her grandmother had to give, measuring the quantity of remaining time with the quiet precision of someone who doesn't want to count, but can't help it. Chuida had, progressed with horses to the point where she could ride well enough to go out onto the hills in the morning, though Wap Sapa remained Chaska's horse in a way that wasn't negotiable, and both girls understood this without needing to state it. Chuida had been given a brown mare she called Sikengu, the name of her band, worn as a badge, and the two girls rode together on the mornings when the school schedule permitted, which wasn't often enough, but was something. On one of these mornings, riding out in the early fall light with the grass going gold, the sky the deep blue that comes only in September at that latitude, Chuida said, "What do you think is going to happen with all of it? The land and the agency and everything." Chaska rode for a while without answering, not because she did not have thoughts about it, but because the question was large and she wanted to give a large answer rather than a quick one. "I think many sort of things will change that we can't stop," she said finally. "I think some things will end. I think some things will survive that people would have bet against surviving. I think the people who know who there will carry more than the people who have been convinced to forget. And us. We know who we are." Chuida was quiet for a moment, riding, the brown mare moving easily beside the black stallion. Then, she said, with the bluntness that was her native register, "I'm less sure than you're." This surprised Chaska enough that she looked sideways at her friend. Chuida was looking forward at the hills, her jaw set in the way it set when she was saying something she had been holding for a while. "I know TBH, my name," Chuida said. "Plus, but sometimes I do not know what to do with it. I do not know what comes next, and you always seem to know what comes next." "I don't," Chaska said. "I just trust that what comes next will make sense when it arrives. That is either very wise or very foolish." "Probably both," Chaska said. "I have found they're often the same thing." Chuida made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was related to one. The horses moved through the gold grass, and the morning held them, and Chaska thought about everything that had happened for what it's worth in the past year, and everything that was still unresolved, and everything that was coming that none of them could fully see yet. She thought, I think, about coming down from the hills. The shout before the words, the way it had felt to move at full speed towards something rather than away from it. The way Wap Sapa had moved with her because he always moved with her because that was what they were to each other. She thought about her grandmother's finger against her sternum, about her father's, questions, slow and precise as tools, about her mother's sound, that single brief exhalation that meant a decision had been made, about Hartley's face, sort of, when he had seen her on the horse and had seen for the first time a specific person. She was 15. She sort of did not know, yet that what she had started on that morning when she rode down from the hill shouting would take years to fully play out. She did not know about the things that were coming, the harder winters, the deaths, the losses that would be real and permanent. She did not know about the longer fight, or the things she would have to survive to get through to the other side of it, or the things she would build once she got there. But she knew her name. She knew the horse under her. She knew the hills around her, and the language in her bones, and the stories her grandmother was still giving her, evening by evening, while there was still time. She knew that she had come down from the hills shouting, and the world hadn't ended. It had, in fact, started to move in a way that it hadn't been moving before. Things had shifted, small things so far. The beginning of something rather than the end of something. That was enough. That was more than enough. She pressed one hand against the center of her chest, the writing hand, briefly like a check. Still there. Still there. The hills rose ahead of them, gold in the morning, enormous and patient and enduring, and the two girls rode toward them on horses they had earned, with names that no ledger could carry, into a morning that belonged entirely to them.